There's a crack in the ivory tower at a Canadian university. It concerns the work of Dr. Ranjit Chandra. At one time, he was a prestigious researcher at Memorial University in Newfoundland. Today, some of his work has been called into question. Serious questions about his methods and his motivation. Allegations of scientific fraud. Over the next few nights, we'll tell you about Dr. Chandra's research and how his case was handled by Memorial University. Here's Chris O'Neill-Yates with The Secret Life of Dr. Chandra.
St. John's, Newfoundland. It may seem like an unlikely place for scientific scandal to brew, but in hindsight, it appears perhaps the perfect place. For almost 3 decades, Memorial University provided an out-of-the-way corner of the scientific world for the career of Dr. Ranjit Kumar Chandra to flourish. Over the years, he'd become a world-renowned expert in the field of nutrition and immunology. He was the recipient of the Order of Canada, said to be a 2-time Nobel Prize nominee, a man they called the Jewel of Memorial. But in the summer of 2002, Dr. Chandra packed up his office and quietly slipped into retirement. He'd been accused of committing scientific fraud by one of the world's most prestigious journals. For those who'd followed his work over the years, it was a sad end to an otherwise remarkable career. In 2005, the study that brought Dr. Chandra's career to a halt was officially retracted. That might have been the end of his story, but in fact, it's just the beginning. Over the past year, CBC News has been digging into the career of Dr. Chandra, and what we found is startling. We've uncovered a pattern of scientific fraud and financial deception dating back to the 80s. But perhaps the most astonishing fact is this. The university that employed Dr. Chandra knew he'd committed scientific fraud and did little to stop him. Looking back on his career at Memorial, it's difficult to pinpoint the moment Dr. Chandra's life of deception began.
This morning I'm going to discuss...
By all reports, he was an engaging teacher and good with patients, but those things seldom deliver international recognition. So if recognition didn't come his way naturally, he was not adverse to helping it along. Like the time Dr. Chandra asked former colleague Sean Brosnan to nominate him for a scientific award.
The resume arrived on my desk complete with the nomination letter, which he had written himself, only requiring my signature. And I was sort of impressed. I'd never seen so many superlatives on a page in my life. So I think Ranjit had a healthy ego, and I think his reputation did matter to him.
Dr. Chandra traveled the world, accepting speaking engagements and attending conferences, away from Memorial for as many as 120 days of the year. And still, he managed to turn out study after study, as many as 11 in a single year. In the late 80s, one of the biggest studies Dr. Chandra did was under the direction of this man. Back then, Mark Mazur was a clinical research associate for Ross Pharmaceuticals in the U.S., the company that makes the baby formulas Isomil and Similac. Ross wanted to test whether their formulas could help babies avoid allergies, and they picked Dr. Chandra to conduct the study.
He had, at that time, a worldwide reputation. He was world-renowned for his work. He was one of the very first ones who ever did any research showing that nutrition affected immune development during infancy and childhood.
Dr. Chandra's research nurse at the time was Marilyn Harvey. It would be her job to find 288 newborns whose parents were prone to allergies who were willing to take part in the Ross study. Finding that many allergy-prone babies in a city the size of St. John's was not easy.
Oh, it took basically all of my time. If I worked 40 hours a week, it would also take my time in the evening and sometimes at night. Like, I always felt that I was on call for 24/7 for 2 years or even more.
Around the same time, the food giant Nestle introduced their new formula, Good Start, to the North American market. The product was supposed to help reduce the risk to some infants of developing allergies. But the company was under increasing pressure from the FDA to prove those claims.
Can I have a peep?
Nestle had hired Dr. Chandra to scientifically test their product. But as the pressure on the company mounted in late 1988, Dr. Chandra was just in the early stages of conducting that study.
This was a study that was similar in design to ours. In fact, it was almost identical to ours. And we knew that he had been doing a study for Nestle because, well, frankly, he was rather bold about what he was doing, and he had posted in his office a list of all the grants, the research grants, and who provided them and how much they were, almost as if it were something to be proud of.
By the following summer, Marilyn Harvey had recruited only a handful of subjects for the Nestle study. So she was shocked when she came across this, the already published results of the Nestle study.
I would say there was only probably 1/4 of the patients even recruited in this study. And he had all of the data analyzed and published even before we had even had the data collected.
Mark Mazur saw the study too, and one thing in particular caught his attention. Nestle was comparing their formula to his company's products, yet Mazur's company had never been asked to provide Dr. Chandra with the thousands of clinically labeled cans of their formula that would be needed for such a study.
I asked him directly. I said, Dr. Chandra, I read your study that you published, and I was curious how you labeled all that formula, because obviously we didn't do it for you. And he said, oh, we did it here. Well, that's not very reasonable, because to feed that number of infants, we're talking about 20,000 cans that would have to be labeled. And to do that by hand, we did it by machine at the factory. And to do that by hand with a handful of staff is pretty unreasonable. So I was very suspicious from that point on.
And that wasn't all. Almost the same time the Nestle study was published, Dr. Chandra published yet another baby formula study, this one for Mead Johnson. This one with more than 200 babies enrolled. That made 3 studies involving more than 700 babies that Marilyn Harvey was supposed to have worked on.
I think even on the back he thanked me. I think that was an article. Thank Marilyn Harvey for her diligent work, and I thought, but I didn't do this. This is not what I am doing. This is, published too early, and the numbers are not correlating.
Is it possible that someone else recruited those other babies?
Impossible. Where? You couldn't do a study of this magnitude and not be visible.
And there was another bewildering fact. In the Nestle and Mead Johnson studies, Dr. Chandra concluded that those companies' products help reduce the risk of allergies, while the Ross formula, which was very similar, did nothing.
I said, Dr. Chandra, how can you explain that we didn't see anything with our study and you did with the Nestle study? And he said, well, the study really wasn't designed right. I said, Dr. Chandra, we designed the study with you. You designed it. That's why we went to you, so you would be able to do it correctly. And he said, well, you didn't really pay me enough money to do it correctly.
The turning point for Marilyn Harvey came when she happened to see a summary of yet another paper Dr. Chandra planned to submit for publication. It was a 5-year follow-up on the Nestle study, a follow-up on a study that she knew hadn't been done in the first place. She agonized over whether or not to report him.
Here I am working with a world-renowned nutritionist, trend-setting allergist, immunologist. Like, could I be wrong? I mean, you do second guess yourself. Could I be wrong? I didn't want to jeopardize all the good work that was being done at Memorial University of Newfoundland. But yet, this story had to be told, and someone else had to realize that this was happening.
And so, Marilyn Harvey reluctantly became a whistleblower. The university put together an independent panel to investigate the allegations against Dr. Chandra. They spent 5 months interviewing witnesses and examining 5 of his publications. The investigators were all asked to sign a confidentiality agreement, so the results have never been made public. However, we've obtained a copy of their report. The report concluded, with the evidence presented, the testimony of many witnesses, and the fact that absolutely no raw data or files of any kind were exhibited, the committee cannot accept that the Nestle study was done anywhere near to the completeness or with the accuracy reported. For that matter, the same can probably be said for the Mead-Johnson work, as published in the British Medical Journal. In fact, the committee cannot identify anyone who did or remembers doing a significant amount of work, and the co-authors of the papers had very little or very likely nothing to do with the work. With respect to the allegations, the committee is therefore led to conclude that scientific misconduct has been committed by Dr. Chandra. But despite the committee's conclusions, the university decided not to take any action against Dr. Chandra. University Vice President Jack Strawbridge says the investigation was dropped because Dr. Chandra accused the committee of bias and threatened to sue.
The university was facing a potential lawsuit. There would be loss of reputation, loss of income, etc. You could be looking at a very, very large lawsuit, and the university would want to be sure that it was on firm footing before it took any disciplinary action. I mean, the only disciplinary action that would be appropriate in a circumstance like that would be firing. I mean, you're not going to suspend him if it was as gross as what the committee concluded, you know, something very substantial. And fabricating research results is usually considered a capital crime in academia.
So was the university so afraid of being sued that it let Dr. Chandra essentially get away with academic fraud?
Universities like ours are publicly funded. I think if Dr. Chandra had been working in a different area of science where let's say life and death were involved, if he were claiming a cure for cancer, let's say, that was fraudulent.
But these were babies and baby formula at a time when hypoallergenic formula was pretty much an unknown entity.
But he was looking at reducing the incidence of ectopic eczema. It wasn't the same as life and death matters, where I think if those had been at stake, it's possible the university might have acted differently.
While the investigation against Dr. Chandra had been going on, the editors of one medical journal had been hanging on to a study he'd submitted to them for publication. But when the Journal of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition was told by Memorial that there was insufficient evidence to prove Dr. Chandra had committed fraud, they went ahead and published his 5-year follow-up on the Nestle milk study. A follow-up on a study that had never been done in the first place. Jack Strawbridge says the journal's editor should have read between the lines.
If I was the editor of a journal and I was told by a scientist's home university that there wasn't sufficient evidence to proceed, to me that is a huge red flag. I don't know why they would have published the paper. I wouldn't have if I was the journal editor.
But they were counting on you as a university to tell them the straight goods about whether or not Dr. Chandra had committed scientific fraud.
In the delicate world in which we live, and that is as close to the straight goods as you're probably going to get.
It had been 3 years since Marilyn Harvey had blown the whistle on Dr. Chandra. The news that Memorial would take no action against him came as a shock. Still, she's never doubted that she did the right thing. Why was your conviction so firm?
Because it was fraud. It was academic fraud. It was wrong. It was just purely wrong. It was wrong.
How many more of Dr. Chandra's studies are there that might contain fraudulent results? It's difficult to say without seeing the raw data. However, the journals in which Dr. Chandra published might want to take a look at some of his studies, including this one, for example, in the Canadian Journal of Public Health. It's based on data from the non-existent Nestle study. Or this $61,000 study done for the Newfoundland government on the effect of fish oil on rheumatoid arthritis. We could find no evidence it had been done at all. Or his best-known study published in The Lancet in 1992. We tried to contact the people Dr. Chandra thanked for their help, but none of those we could find recalled working on the study. And according to Berkeley professor Seth Roberts, there are other reasons to be suspicious about this one.
There's the statistical impossibilities in the Lancet paper, and there's mistakes. There's inconsistency between the graphs and the text. And there's this claim that everybody approached agreed to be in the study. That's just not possible.
And there's more. When we return, Dr. Chandra strikes again.
The statisticians said this has all the hallmarks of having been completely invented.
In the spring of 2000, a study arrived at the London offices of the prestigious British Medical Journal. Dr. Chandra had submitted a study to them about the effects of his own patented multivitamin on the memories of seniors. One of the journal's editors was so convinced something was wrong with it, he asked the editor-in-chief, Richard Smith, to have a look at it.
I thought, yes, I have all kinds of doubts about this too. We then sent it to two reviewers, one a statistical expert with a lot of experience of research misconduct, and to a reviewer who knew about the kind of work it was, and both of them had very serious doubts. In fact, the statistician said this has all the hallmarks of having been completely invented.
The BMJ rejected Dr. Chandra's study and asked Memorial to investigate.
So they sent that to us, and we thought, oh, here we go, and something else, you know. And President asked the then Vice President Research and myself to have a look at it.
Dr. Chandra, meanwhile, wasn't about to allow a rejection from the BMJ to stand in his way. He submitted the same study to another journal, Nutrition, and this time he got lucky. The September 2001 issue carried Dr. Chandra's study about the effects of a multivitamin on the memory of seniors, a multivitamin he'd already patented. The results were so startling, they caught the attention of the New York Times, and that ironically was bad news for Dr. Chandra. Psychology professor Saul Sternberg from the University of Pennsylvania read about Chandra's remarkable results. And he called his friend, Berkeley University professor Seth Roberts. Both professors found the results too good to be true.
Forever and ever, people would be taking these multivitamin supplements after they got to age 65, because it was incredible what he found. It would have changed everyone's life, you know, millions and billions of people's lives, if it was true. And yet here it was in just an average journal. What's that about?
Dr. Chandra claimed to have given 96 healthy seniors from St. John's a daily multivitamin pill for a year. He then tested their memory for improvements. But the test results didn't make sense.
It turned out that the scores that his subjects were getting put them in the demented category. The average score made them demented. Now, so they would have been hospitalized or under some kind of care, but in fact he claimed that none of them was demented. They were all normal, functioning people.
Yeah, these people would have been too demented to understand what a study was, if you believed his numbers.
And yet, after just 1 year of taking his multivitamin, these same seniors went from demented to completely normal. And then there was Dr. Chandra's claim that he tested each vitamin in his multivitamin separately and at different strengths.
It's unbelievable. It's just too much work. Gigantic resources would be needed to do such a study. There's no, he would have to have a gigantic grant just to do that study.
Couple of people, dozens of people, thousands of dollars, millions of
dozens of
dollars?
helpers and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
The two researchers found many more glaring errors in Dr. Chandra's study. Is there any possible explanation for the errors that you found in Dr. Chandra's study?
Oh yes, there's a very possible explanation. It's that he made it up.
By 2002, Dr. Chandra knew his studies were under attack, and in what now appears to have been a desperate bid to shore up support for his two beleaguered studies, he published two more, this time in his own journal, Nutrition Research. The first publication backed up the findings of his study that was under attack. The second study by an Amrit Jain happened to support the findings of his 1992 Lancet study that had also been questioned. Unfortunately, no one has ever been able to find Amrit Jain.
He had no email address, which is very strange, and his mailing address was a rented mailbox in Canada. His institutional affiliation was in India, but his physical mailbox was in Canada. And not only that, it was a rented mailbox. That's extraordinary.
I think that Jane never did the study. Jane may not even exist. There may be no such nutritional scientist called Jane.
By 2002, Memorial University knew once again it had a problem. They asked Dr. Chandra to turn over his data. He accused the university of losing it.
It's like little kids talking, you know, the dog ate my homework, somebody stole my data, or you've lost my data.
Well, that immediately sets all kinds of alarm bells ringing. I mean, it is a condition of submitting a study to the BMJ that if we ask to see the original data, you have to produce it. And if you can't, then I'm afraid the assumption is that probably this was invented.
Rather than turn over his data, Dr. Chandra retired in the summer of 2002, just as he says he'd always planned to do. Memorial shut the door behind him and considered the case closed. Again.
We tried, we weren't able to get the data, and he resigned. Are there other things we might have done? Well, there's always things you could do, I suppose, but a lot of them would involve so many resources that we might be accused of having been seen as a witch hunt.
A witch hunt is definitely not what Marilyn Harvey had in mind. A satisfactory conclusion to the investigation would have been enough.
I'm very sad. I have had periods of devastation, and then I have had periods saying, you did what you could do, let it go. So that's how I try to live. I did what I could do as a nurse, as a person. I did what I could do. That's it.
Since retiring in 2002, Dr. Chandra travels the world, speaking at conferences, publishing studies, and tending to his new vitamin pill business. So far, only one of his studies has been retracted. The rest remain in the published literature, even though by our count, there are at least 10 that are either fraudulent or highly suspicious. Apparently, getting away with fraud is not that hard. Tomorrow night in part 2, we followed Dr. Chandra's trail to Switzerland, and we asked the obvious question. If Dr. Chandra didn't do all those studies, what happened to the money he got for doing all those studies? I'm wondering, how does a researcher from Newfoundland have 120 bank accounts in over a dozen countries with millions of dollars?
I'm not willing to answer it without my I know you.
He was out to feed his bank account any way he could.
What do you know about the funding that Dr. Chandra received outside of Memorial?
Almost nothing.
That's part 2 of The Secret Life of Dr. Chandra, tomorrow night on The National. I'm Chris O'Neill Yates.
We've asked Dr. Chandra for a sit-down interview repeatedly over the past year, but this afternoon, after we announced the story would be broadcast tonight, a lawyer acting on his behalf said Dr. Chandra would now agree to be interviewed, but next week at the earliest and prior to the broadcast of the story. We declined to delay tonight's report, and we repeated our invitation to Dr. Chandra to interview him on these topics at any time.